In the spring of 1953, the world was presented with the secret of life. A structure so elegant it seemed to have sprung fully formed from the minds of two brilliant young scientists, James Watson and Francis Crick. Their names are etched into history. The story of their triumph is one of the foundational myths of genetics. But this is the reason that model exists. This is photograph 51, an X-ray diffraction image of a DNA fiber, taken in May 1952 at King's College London. The woman who created it, who perfected the technique to capture it, was Dr. Rosalind Franklin, a master of X-ray crystallography. To her, this was not an icon, it was data, the sharpest, clearest evidence ever obtained that DNA was a helix. She worked in isolation, in a climate of rivalry and personal tension. And in January of 1953, this photograph, her photograph, was shown to her competitors without her knowledge. It was the final missing piece of their puzzle. Within weeks, the model was built, the Nobel Prize was won, and Rosalind Franklin's name was relegated to a footnote. This is not a story of a collaborative eureka moment. It is a story of a high-stakes race, of a brilliant piece of detective work, and of evidence that changed hands before it could be presented by the woman who discovered it. For decades, the narrative was simple. Watson and Crick saw what others could not, but history, when examined closely, tells a different tale. A tale of how the most celebrated discovery in modern biology was made not just with genius, but with a photograph that belonged to someone else. This is the true story of the photograph behind the double helix. The early 1950s saw a quiet, intense race. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, Linus Pauling, the world's foremost chemist, was closing in on the structure of DNA. In England, a handful of researchers knew the prize. The secret of heredity itself was there for the taking. Into this race stepped Dr. Rosalind Franklin. In January of 51, she arrived at King's College London's biophysics unit. She was an expert in a highly specialized field, using X-rays to deduce the atomic structure of crystals. Her new mission applied that skill to the slippery, fibrous mystery of DNA. A critical misunderstanding sowed the first seeds of conflict. The lab director, John Randall, had hired Franklin to lead the DNA X-ray work independently. But her colleague, Maurice Wilkins, who had been studying DNA for years, was away when she arrived. He returned, assuming the new PhD was his subordinate. It was a disastrous start. Their personalities and methods were oil and water. Franklin was fiercely direct, data-driven, and private. Wilkins was shy, theoretical, and felt his domain had been invaded. The partnership collapsed. They barely spoke. The lab fractured into two hostile camps, both working on the same molecule, but not together. Undaunted, Franklin focused on the monumental technical challenge. DNA was a gel, not a neat crystal. She perfected a method to pull individual, hydrated fibers, keeping the molecule in its natural, wet state, which was crucial. This was a feat few in the world could match. She and her graduate student, Raymond Gosling, then tackled the camera. They adjusted the humidity, the alignment, the exposure time with obsessive care. For months, the images were blurry and inconclusive. Contrary to myth, Franklin was not anti-helix. Her early data suggested a helical shape, but she was a rigorous empiricist. She saw clues of a more complex structure within the helix and refused to jump to a pretty model without proof. She demanded the data speak first, a stance that put her at odds with the model builders in Cambridge. Then, in May of 1952, after a year of painstaking work, they achieved it. The exposure that produced photograph 51, when it was developed, the clarity was staggering. To a crystallographer, this was a treasure map. The bold X was the unequivocal signature of a helix. The pattern's dimensions revealed the helix's exact size and shape. It was, as one historian would later say, the Rosetta Stone of molecular biology. For Franklin, this was not the end, but the beginning of the real work. She filed the photograph and its data away and began the slow, meticulous process of mathematical analysis to extract its full meaning. She was playing a long, careful game, unaware that in Cambridge, others were playing a much faster one. She had secured the single most important piece of evidence in the race. She believed she had time. She did not know that the walls of her lab, strained by silence and rivalry, were about to crack. 50 miles away in Cambridge, James Watson and Francis Crick were the antithesis of Franklin's methodical pace. They were model builders, theorists who believed the best way to find a structure was to physically construct it, but without hard data, they were building in the dark. Their latest effort was a public embarrassment, a three-stranded model that Franklin had already disproven in a lecture they attended. Watson, in particular, was obsessed. He cultivated contacts, attending lectures, and prying for any scrap of information from the King's College lab. His advantage was not equipment, but an informal intelligence network. Back at King's, Maurice Wilkins was a man in purgatory. He was officially co-head of the DNA effort, but cut off from its most promising data. The estrangement from Franklin was total. He saw his life's work being completed behind a door he could not open. In late 52, a bureaucratic formality created a back channel. A confidential King's College progress report, intended for funding bodies, was shared with Cambridge. It contained a summary of Franklin's latest findings, including precise numerical data on the DNA molecule's dimensions. For Crick, a trained physicist, these numbers were a gift. Then, in late January 1953, Watson came to King's to see Wilkins. Franklin was reportedly away from her lab. What happened next is documented in Watson's own memoir. Wilkins, perhaps seeking an ally, perhaps wanting someone to appreciate the work of his lab, showed Watson the photograph. It was a profound breach of scientific ethics. The photograph was Franklin and Gosling's unpublished data, their intellectual property. Watson didn't need it explained. As a biologist who understood helical signatures, he recognized the pattern instantly. It was not just a helix. The clarity suggested two strands, intertwined. In that moment, the race was effectively over. Returning to Cambridge in a fever, Watson told Crick what he'd seen. Armed with the visual proof of Photo 51 and the numerical specs from Franklin's report, they embarked on a final, frenzied construction. They were now building with the answer key in hand. Meanwhile, Rosalind Franklin continued her work, methodically preparing her own full analysis for publication. She was compiling the proof, unaware that the conclusion had already been reached using her data. In early March, with their model complete, Wilkins brought Watson to King's to show Franklin. It was a staggering moment. She was presented with the finished solution to the puzzle she had been painstakingly solving. Franklin, ever the scientist, is said to have examined it quietly. She saw it fit the evidence. She offered no objection. Whether this was professional grace, shock, or an understanding of the unspoken rules of the game, it allowed the narrative of independent discovery to proceed. On April 25, 1953, 3 papers were published together in Nature. Watson and Crick's paper, containing their double helix model, included this line: "We have also been stimulated by a knowledge of the general nature of the unpublished experimental results and ideas of Dr. M.H.F. Wilkins and Dr. R.E. Franklin." It was a masterpiece of understatement. The evidence had been taken. The model was built. The papers were published. And with a single, vague phrase, the most critical contribution was relegated to the status of a helpful nudge. The announcement was a global sensation. The press, and soon the world, anointed Watson and Crick as the sole discoverers. The narrative was clean, compelling. 2 brilliant young men had seen the secret of life, where others saw only confusion. The messy, collaborative, and contentious reality was erased. Franklin, perhaps wishing to leave a toxic environment behind, left King's College in the spring of 53. At Birkbeck College, she began pioneering work on the structure of viruses, establishing an independent and highly respected research group. She never publicly contested the DNA narrative. In 1962, the Nobel Prize cemented the story in history. The award went to Watson, Crick, and Wilkins for their discoveries concerning the molecular structure of nucleic acids. Rosalind Franklin was not mentioned. By the strict rules of the Nobel Committee, she could not be awarded posthumously, as she had died 4 years earlier. But her absence from the narrative was a choice made long before her death. In 56, Franklin was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She continued to work with remarkable courage and productivity throughout her treatment. She died in April of 1958 at the age of 37. Her obituaries noted her excellent work, but the DNA story was told as the triumph of Watson and Crick. A decade later, James Watson dropped a bomb on the tidy myth. His best-selling memoir, The Double Helix, was shockingly candid. He depicted the race, the rivalries, and his own blunt ambition. And for the first time, a mass audience read his account of being shown Rosie's photo, the photo that made his mouth fall open. Watson's book sparked a backlash. In 1975, writer Anne Sayre, a friend of Franklin's, published a landmark biography. Meticulously researched, it dismantled the caricature of the difficult Rosie and laid bare the extent of her contributions and the systemic sexism she faced. The historical correction had begun. Decades of scholarship have now established the consensus. While Watson and Crick performed the act of synthesis and model building, the decisive, directive evidence came from Rosalind Franklin. Photo 51 and her measurements were not a vague inspiration, they were the blueprint. Today, her legacy is twofold. Institutions and Mars rovers bear her name, a formal correction of the historical record. But more powerfully, her story has become the definitive case study in discussions of scientific ethics, credit, and gender bias. She is a symbol for every researcher whose work was overlooked or appropriated. So, where does the credit lie? With the theorists who built the elegant final model, or with the experimentalist who secured the unambiguous proof that made the model possible? History has rendered its slow, deliberate verdict. The double helix is Watson and Crick's monument, but its foundation, the bedrock upon which it stands, is Rosalind Franklin's photograph. Two artifacts define this story. One is a model, a perfect representation of an idea. The other is a photograph, a record of unvarnished evidence. For decades, we celebrated the idea and forgot the evidence. The injustice done to Rosalind Franklin was not that she didn't win a Nobel Prize, it was that, for a generation, she was written out of the story of her own discovery. Her brilliance was recast as mere technical support. Her definitive evidence was treated as a stepping stone for others rather than the destination of her own rigorous journey. Her story is not unique. It reveals a persistent pattern in how we narrate scientific triumph. We often favor the singular eureka of theory over the meticulous, collective grind of evidence. And too often, that grind is done by those on the margins, the juniors, the technicians, the women, whose contributions are easily absorbed by the narrative of a leading name. So, what does her legacy ask of us? It asks us to look more carefully at the foundations of our knowledge, to ask not just who had the idea, but who did the work, who produced the proof. Rosalind Franklin discovered a fundamental truth with patience and precision. That truth, the structure of DNA, has reshaped our world. In remembering her story is how we defend another truth, that credit belongs to the work, not just to the final act. If you believe in honoring that deeper, more honest history, help us tell the next chapter. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tap the notification bell. This has been For What It's Worth.